Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Steve. If there's anybody in the room and we've not met before, my name is Steve. I'm part of the lead team here, and it's great to have you with us if it, is your first time, and also great to have you with us if it's your 1000th time, wherever you fall along the route there. So we've just been asking that question here in the room and online as well. What is your favorite film? So shout them out. Excellent. Can't hear what you're saying, but Ben-Hur. That's a long one, isn't it? How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. Excellent. Any more for any more? Christmas Chronicles. That's a good one. Sorry, what was that at the back there? The Greatest Showman. Was there something over here as well? No? Okay. Well, at the start of the service, let's just go track back a moment. Actually, Di asked what people watched on TV last night. And somebody said Match of the Day. I hear it was a good one last night. Is that right? Heard it was a good one. Anyway, the link to the film. We're going to do a quick quiz together, if that's okay. And I'm gonna give you some description spoilers of films, and I want you to tell me if you know what the film is. Is that okay? So let's try this, okay? First description spoiler. Luke, I'm your dad. Which one? I think it's Empire Strikes Back, is that right? Yes. Okay, let's try this next one. A young lion becomes a vegan. Anyone know that one? It's The Lion King. The Lion King. Well done. Okay, I think this one's fairly easy. A forgetful fish remembers an address and helps reunite a father. Hang on, I'm not finished yet. And helps reunite a father and son. Finding Nemo. Well done. Well done. Okay, this last one, I think this might be the hardest one. So see if you can get this. A group spends 9 hours returning some jewelry. Lord of the Rings. Who said Lord of the Rings? Well done over there, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I don't know about you, but I find it really annoying when somebody gives a spoiler to a film or a TV series. And I have a sister-in-law, her name is Lois, and she's really bad at doing that. Anybody else not like it when somebody spoils a film or something for them? And what I thought I'd do today is I thought I would spoil the message for you by giving you a bit of a spoiler for what we're going to look at together today. So if you have a Bible, turn with me to Matthew chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, it's going to come up on the screen so you can follow with me. It says this at the beginning of Matthew chapter 1. This is in the New Testament, right at the beginning of the New Testament, and this is what we call the genealogy of Jesus. And so, confession time. Who's ever skipped past the genealogy part of the Bible? There's a few of us that have done that. And we're going to look at it a little bit together today. It says this. This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. And then it says this. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. That is our spoiler for today. Can anybody spot the spoiler of where we might be going? Ruth. Oh, it's highlighted, isn't it? How helpful is that for you all? So we're in our Women of the Bible series, and last week we looked together at the lives of Naomi, of Orpah, and Ruth, which was part 11. And we saw how grieving in community with God and his people can lead to hope. And now this week we're in our final part of our Women of the Bible series, but I just thought first it would be good to take a moment and appreciate the many different voices that we have heard from during our Women of the Bible series. So thank you to Rachel Lewis, to Howard, David, Kemi, Justine, Phil, Sally, Rachel White, and to Alyssa as well for sharing in this series. It's been really good to hear from so many different voices. And this week we're going to conclude our series by looking together and exploring another aspect of God's heart, which we see in our woman for today, which is Ruth. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, why does Ruth get 2 weeks in this series? Do you have some kind of bias towards Ruth? I absolutely do, and I make no apologies for it. That's the name of my wife, if you didn't know. In Matthew chapter 1, what we've just read in our spoiler together, we discover that Ruth, who is the Moabite widow that we looked at last week, she becomes part of Jesus' family line. She marries the son of Rahab, and she becomes David's great-grandma, a major figure, if you didn't know, in Jewish history. So this is a big shift, isn't it, from where we left our story last week. For a quick refresher, Naomi, along with her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they had to go to Judah. They had to leave Judah as refugees, and they found themselves in a land called Moab. And there's a map that's just going to come up on the screen now, which will show you the route that they had to go from Bethlehem at the top there, and then round into a neighboring nation called Moab, which is where modern-day Jordan is. Naomi and her family, they left Judah because of a severe famine. And so they were seeking a better life as refugees in the land of Moab, a land which, when we look back at history through the Bible, we see it was a land that was traditionally very hostile towards Judah and vice versa. What we find is that tragically, Naomi's husband and her 2 sons die whilst they are in the land of Moab. And so she is left alone in a foreign land. But her sons had married 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And Naomi, she decides that she hears news that there's food in Judah, so she decides to head back to Judah, and she says to her 2 daughter-in-laws, you stay here, you go back to your families. And we see that Orpah chose to do that, but Ruth chose to go with Naomi. And so Ruth chapter 1 that we looked at together last week, it tells us this story of a refugee family who were seeking help, and they were experiencing great loss, as we looked at. Well, chapter 2, which we're going to look at today, follows Ruth and her story, another refugee, as she seeks a better life in Judah. As a vulnerable woman, as a vulnerable refugee without a husband and without children, life would have been very difficult for Ruth at this time. Yet what we see is that over 1,000 years later, Ruth, this Moabite refugee widow, is now part of the family line of Jesus, who is the Savior of the world. And so I don't know about you, but you may be wondering, well, how did this happen? What is the kind of turn of events that happens in her life, considering that desperate situation that we left her in last week? And I'm glad that you asked, because that's what we're going to look at together today. So Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, it says this: Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter." We're going to pause there for a moment, because we've been introduced to another character who was there in the spoiler that we looked at earlier, and his name is Boaz. Everybody say Boaz. It's a good name to say. Boaz becomes one day the great grandpa of King David. And so perhaps you can join the dots that there's something of a love story here in the book of Ruth. We're not going to get to that part today, but there's another spoiler for you. Boaz is a wealthy and an influential person, and he's a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. What we read as we read through this is he's clearly a follower of God. I don't know about you. I don't know whether you've ever gone to work and your boss has said, God bless you, as you've arrived. Anybody had that experience? We see something of Boaz here. We see something of his heart. And actually what we know, if you know anything about the Bible, and if you don't worry, I'll explain it very quickly to you, but we know that this is something of a miracle. Because does anybody remember from our spoiler what the name of Boaz's mum is? Is Rahab. And if you know anything about the story of Rahab, you'll know that it is an incredible, miraculous story about a woman who wasn't part of the Israelite nation, but she showed great welcome and showed great bravery and courage. And because of her bravery and courage, we get this man, Boaz, in the story of God. We see from the way that he greeted his followers then that he is a follower of God. And we see something, I believe, about the workplace culture that Boaz had clearly set for his employees. And we see it from his interaction with the foreman of his farm. He asks after Ruth, and he's told that his foreman had let her go around and pick up grain that was left behind. Now, this is some really kind of important context for us today, because I think it reminds us of God's heart for refugees. God has a big heart for refugees and for all who are vulnerable to injustice in society. And that's why he put things in place in the law of their day like this. This is from Leviticus, a book in the Old Testament, and it says this. It says, "Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So we see there God's heart for people like Ruth in our story today. That was in Leviticus 19, verse 33 to 34. And then if you jump forward just 4 chapters in the book of Leviticus, we get some really helpful context for what was going on in the land here. It says this, it says, "When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God." And so we see that Boaz has set this workplace culture that follows God's heart for the most vulnerable in society. And so God's heart was at work through Boaz. This heart was being shown towards our woman of the Bible here, Ruth, who was both a foreigner and a widow and was allowed to pick up the leftovers of grain. And so here's, I think, our first challenge from the story in the life of Ruth and where we pick it up today. How are we making sure that God's heart for the most vulnerable in society is being demonstrated in our lives? Maybe like Boaz, you are an influential person. You have a position of influence. How are you using that influence to reflect God's heart in the world around you? When you're in the staff room or on the playground or, lifting weights in the gym, wherever it may be for you, what does it look like in your life to champion the most vulnerable in our society? Or just as important, what does it look like to challenge others when they discriminate against the most vulnerable in our society? Let's read on in Ruth chapter 2, verse 8. It says this, "Boaz went over and said to Ruth, 'Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I am only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about everything that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers." And we'll pause it there again. So here we see more of God's heart for refugees at work through Boaz, as he does two important things. Firstly, he provides protection for Ruth by telling the young men on his farm to treat her well. Again, Boaz is standing up for the rights and for justice of the vulnerable. Boaz, we see, protected Ruth, a vulnerable widow, a refugee from Moab, ensuring her safety. And he also took the time, as we see, to understand her story, her cultural background, her situation. He showed informed care and compassion for her. We see that he knew everything about her, about what she had done for her mother-in-law, about the care that she had shown. Let's finish this passage together. It says this from verse 14. "At mealtime, Boaz called to her, 'Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine.' So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, 'Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time.' So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal." There's two more ways that Boaz demonstrated God's heart here for refugees. Boaz showed great generosity by inviting Ruth, a foreigner, to join him for lunch, setting aside cultural barriers. And he further restored her dignity by ensuring that she could gather the barley, allowing her to feel that value that many of us will feel and experience in our lives and want to feel, the value of hard work, and for her to earn her way. You know, fleeing from home and leaving behind family, jobs, and security is never an easy decision. And refugees arrive in our communities forced to rebuild their lives from scratch. And often when they first arrive, they're unable to work for long periods of time and live on just a very small allowance. I think just as Boaz invited Ruth to work and restore her dignity, I think the challenge then is, how are we creating opportunities for refugees, for asylum seekers, to use their skills and to support them in rebuilding their lives? The story of Ruth is one of great sadness in what she had experienced that we looked at last week through the loss of her husband, the loss of her brother-in-law, the loss of her father-in-law. It is a story of compassion. It's a story of bravery. It's a story of great kindness as she left with Naomi for a land that was not her own. And I think it's also a story of how a follower of God who was in a position of influence through small, yet very significant acts of kindness went about making sure that a young refugee widow was taken care of in society. I want to see revival in witness. Anybody with me? I want to see revival in the community that I live in. I want to see revival come in the communities that you represent. And I'm glad that some of you are excited by that. But I wonder what comes to your mind when you hear that word and when you think of revival. I think what we find here in the book of Ruth is a refugee, childless widow who receives a welcome in a land that is not her own. And as a result of this, as we read from our spoiler in Matthew chapter 1, she finds herself part of the family of God. That's what I think revival looks like. I think revival looks like demonstrating the love of Jesus in small ways that can have eternal and lasting impact. I think revival looks like demonstrating the love of Jesus in how we welcome asylum seekers and refugees into our communities. As we witnessed in our towns, in our communities just over a month ago, not everyone in our society is out to provide that kind of welcome. But if our hearts have come alive to Jesus, then I believe we have a responsibility to live out his love in our communities. I think revival looks like going out of our way to demonstrate Jesus' love in how we look after widows in our communities. I think revival looks like caring for vulnerable children, whether that's through supporting through friends and families in our community who are struggling to look after their children, or maybe it's through taking the step to foster or adopt and helping children who need a loving forever family. I think revival looks like providing homes for widows, for people struggling with addiction, for people in need of refuge. I think revival looks like helping people as they face food insecurity, who are struggling to make ends meet by providing them with a meal. I think revival looks like standing up for racial justice in our communities and making sure that the color of someone's skin is in no way a barrier for opportunity. I think revival comes where we, as followers of Jesus, seek to bring restoration to our communities, serving in the margins, standing with the poor, the marginalized, and with those who are powerless for whatever reason, working to see things made right. Revival comes as we seek to represent God's kingdom on earth, in witness, in our communities, as it is in heaven. As we reflect on Boaz and the welcome that he showed to both Ruth and Naomi, we see how God moves just as powerfully in the small acts of kindness that have the power to change society. Ruth experiences revival through this small act of kindness, of generosity, of protection, of dignity. Her story reflects God's heart for the vulnerable. And I believe that we are called to represent God's heart amid today's chaos in many ways. Many in our community are just like Ruth, seeking asylum, refuge, unfamiliar with their new surroundings. And I think the challenge comes to us all. How can we demonstrate God's welcoming heart by providing sanctuary and refuge today? And so I have 3 very simple next steps for us all that I think we could all go away and just do at least one of them in some way. The first one is this: we can listen humbly. We can listen humbly. All of us can take time to listen and to build relationships with asylum seekers and refugees in our communities. But make sure you do this. Make sure it is with a genuine interest. Don't treat people in our communities like they're your project. Oh, Steve said I need to find out more about you. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to go out and we need to seek to be a people of welcome, to be a people that look to build friendship and to show and express God's love. Ruth, my wife, not the lady that we've just been talking about in the Bible, she shared this story with me this week, and she said I could share it with you. This is Ruth's word. She says, I have been volunteering for an asylum seeker and refugee charity called Trinity Safe Space and A Better Tomorrow. And at the beginning, I was supporting some families by dropping off food to their home as they were in an isolated part of the town, not near a supermarket. One day, one of the women invited me in as she had made some food. As we got talking, she began sharing about her heartbreaking journey to the UK with her young baby. And I commented to her that I was really sorry. I hadn't realized just how traumatic it had been for them. My friend's response was humbling. She said, it's because you're always rushing around, dropping things off for us. This is Ruth's words now. She said, these women appreciated this help, but they also wanted to host and to make food and to talk. And not necessarily to talk about their story, as this is painful and traumatic to talk about, but to build relationship, to build friendship, and to have meaningful contact. We are designed for relationship. Humans long for contact and interaction. And so sometimes the practical is important and helpful, but not at the expense of building relationship and having meaningful contact. We can all make an effort to listen humbly. The second thing is to learn deeply. Learn deeply. This week, why don't you just do something in some way to educate yourself on the process of seeking refuge in the UK and the experiences of asylum seekers in our community as people seek safety in unfamiliar environments. I think empathy and support are essential. And we get that when we understand something of their experience. For those, there are those in our community who have experienced that. But for those of us who haven't experienced what it's like to flee from conflict or from persecution, it's crucial to learn through the stories of others, understanding their cultural backgrounds and values. It helps us to avoid the assumptions that so many of us can often make. And it fosters this genuine connection. Only then, I think, will we be a truly welcoming and empathetic community. And we're going to later today share some resources with you if you're on our mailing list. If you're not on our mailing list, then you can head to over there where it says Connect Point after the service, and whoever's on the Connect Point would gladly get you signed up to our mailing list. But I just wanted to highlight these two resources to you. This one is called Refugees in God's Story, and it's got, I think it's 42 different Bible stories on immigration and displacement. I really recommend this to you. You can pick this up. I think it's £5 from welcomechurches.org. This is brilliant, such a great resource. And then the other resource is this book, which is called Who Are Refugees and Migrants? I think on Amazon you can get this for $3.99 on Kindle. Another brilliant resource, particularly a good one if you're trying to journey through things like this with children, but also great if you are 78 and you just want to learn more about refugees and migrants. Whatever age you are, that's a great resource. And then the third and final thing is this, the last point, living generously. Living generously, I think, is something that we could all do in some way. For some of us, that might look like a financial thing. For others, it might look like time and effort and energy in some way. But it's something we could all do.